Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game, with me, Kevin Dale of University's Kieran Maguire. And you see how chipper I sound, Kieran? That proves that some comedians can act. Unlike in Wonka, which I watched on Saturday night, which proves that many comedians cannot act and many actors are not funny. Which is by way of a distraction, of course. Because you're not just Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire, Brighton Hove Albion's Kieran Maguire. Your biggest win against Palace since 1956, when I imagine Roy Hodgson was also coaching Palace. And we're recording this on Sunday. I've got my fingers crossed that by the time it goes out, he won't be coaching Palace. We can get on with the serious business of recasting him as a legend rather than the man who's going to relegate. Did you have a nice day? Yeah, I'm sure you had a lovely day, Kieran, didn't you, on Saturday? It's a good result. Apart from the fact you lost a small amount of money betting on the opposition to win, as you know, that was my one consolation at 5:10. Well, yeah, I bet he's happy, except for that tenner he lost. That'll teach him.
Yes, all is good. All is good. Recording the show and then heading back up to Liverpool. I think I'm doing an Everton podcast tonight, and
nice. Good luck.
a few others. Lined up for the next few days, as well as doing teaching. I do actually have a day job.
You still do? Yeah, you're still doing that, and that's nice.
Yes.
Yeah, to make matters worse, on Saturday, I wasn't too bad because Ali was back off tour on Saturday, so more important things. But we had, and she's got a friend staying on Saturday night. Well, I tell you what, let's cheer Kevin up. We'll treat ourselves and we'll watch Wonka, and it did the opposite of cheer me up, Kieran. It actually angered me. It should have been called That'll Do, basically, because if ever a film was made at 5:30 on a Friday, quite clearly the process went along the lines of, hello, Mr. Producer, we've written the third Paddington film, and we've put some of the old jokes in from the first two Paddington films because people like them so much. We've got some of the old sketches and scenarios and plot lines, and the producers obviously said, I'm afraid the bear's not available for a film, and they just went, you got a Wonka? Yeah, all right, we'll do it about him then. It's just, it's questions day, Kieran. We might as well get. We might as well
do a show.
Do the show. Yeah, we've got some stuff off our chests now. I'm pleased to say that people have started to actually add pronunciation notes on their names for this one. Finally, after 4 years of people going, there's some way we could help that poor sod out when it comes to pronouncing our name. If only we could, it's like, great, just phonetics. It's all Barry Walsh. I don't need any help pronouncing Barry Walsh. I like this question because, again, this smacks of two blokes in a pub. Yeah, well, this should happen. Barry says, when a club buys a player and it turns out to be an expensive flop, apart from the manager who signs him, who carries the responsibility for signing the player internally? So far, not a football finance question, just an interesting concept. But then, says Barry, how difficult is it for clubs to get financing for other big-name signings in the future if they've damaged their reputation for signing big-name flops? Do banks' interest rates on loans go up, etc.? Which, as I say, Kieran, smacks of a pub conversation, but it's actually, I think, an interesting question. If a club gets a reputation for not spending money very well, are people going to be more reluctant to lend them money to spend?
Yes, and I think if we address that part of the question first, all banks do a risk assessment when lending money. And one of the things that they will do is that they'll look at your credit history. Now, if your history is one of borrowing money and struggling to repay through not being able to recoup the cost of the player through selling the player for a decent fee, or they're paying them such high wages that the players refuse to leave, then that would have an impact going forwards. It's not as big an impact as where your expected final position in the table is. Because from the bank's point of view, their big fear, should this club be relegated, where does that leave us? And we've seen the likes of MSD Holdings and Macquarie, interest rates have been going up. I think some of the clubs are now paying around about 13-14% on the deals that they've been doing in respect of individual player transfers. Whereas a couple of years ago, you could probably borrow at 7, 8, 9%. So the interest rates are going up where the lenders feel that they are genuinely twitchy about the individual club. If we take a look at Everton, the banks are now very reluctant to lend to Everton. I think we'll be revisiting Everton probably on Thursday, because it looks as if they borrowed yet more money, but no corporate lenders are willing to provide funding for the club. So it certainly does have an impact, because you do that type of assessment. I think it's a valid comment from Barry. In terms of the first part of his question, whilst this sounds glib and cliched, when it comes to player transfers, we always say, success has many parents, failure is an orphan. And when you sign, a Caicedo or a Zaha or whoever's like that, everybody that was even in the corridor when that kid was just walking down will say, "Oh yeah, I could tell from day one that he was a good one." If the player is a flop, then you find people will distance themselves from it. As far as the decision is concerned, we are moving at some clubs from having managers to coaches, in the sense that there will be perhaps a committee which will be very much controlled by the director of football, along with the analysts. Will the coach stroke manager be involved? Yes, but theirs will not necessarily be the senior voice. And I think Liverpool were quite famous for moving towards a committee a few years ago, and they've certainly reaped the rewards there. So you've got the manager, you've got the scouts, you've got the analysts, you've got the director of football, and you would expect on the back of that to make a few wrong decisions. But sometimes things don't work out. I mean, I read an article this week in The Athletic about Calvin Phillips and Manchester City, and sometimes it's good players simply go to the wrong clubs. His style of football wasn't suited for Manchester City, and everybody thought he worked hard in training. He was never any trouble. But sometimes, and this goes for other walks of life, and it all comes down to us. Sometimes your face just doesn't fit, and it's not anybody's fault as such. It's just an issue of circumstance.
Well, with Calvin Phillips, I mean, Guardiola was quite open and public about it, saying he's a really good player. I don't fancy him, basically, which I don't know whether a player will prefer that approach. I suppose as well, in terms of who's responsible for expensive flops, increasingly you've got clubs like Brentford who base their decisions purely on data. And the manager doesn't really get a look in there either. So I'm just interested to clarify the financial side here, Kieran. So if for example, they wouldn't go to Barclays, I imagine, but say Tottenham and Everton were both to go to Barclays and say, we'd like to borrow £100 million. Barclays are probably going to go, well, actually, Tottenham are running their club well. They seem to be prudent. They've paid money back in the past. So, yes, we'll lend it to them at 6% or whatever. But they'll say, not sure too much about Everton. We'll lend them 50 million at 12%. So banks are perfectly able to charge their own rate of interest. They're not tied down to a national rate.
That's right, and also they've got the option to say no, and that's what I think we've seen in respect of some clubs. Spurs, and I've said this on many occasions, Spurs are the best run business in the Premier League, but you don't follow Spurs because of the business side of things. But that has allowed them to borrow. All of that money for the stadium has been borrowed at around about 3.5% interest, which is absolutely fantastic. That's lower than base rates. And that's on the back of having a really good track record. If we go back to the Glazers and when they first acquired Manchester United, nobody had heard of them. Football was seen as a risky business, and Manchester United were paying on some of the PIK loans that they had 14.25%. This is Manchester United. This is what you'd think would be a gold chip company. But the lenders, the lending industry was very suspicious of football 20 years ago, but it's not the case today.
PIK, Kieran, means?
Payment in kind.
Okay.
This is a type of loan very much favoured by my Uncle Terry, where you borrow money and you pay interest, in his case, on a weekly basis, and you add interest to the interest because if somebody can't afford to repay. And Manchester United took out these loans. They didn't pay anything back at all. They didn't pay any interest or any capital back. And then, and you got 14.25 times 14.25. That money very, very quickly adds up. West Brom have got, I think, a similar issue with Warm Front Holdings, where they're paying 5% interest a month. That works out at 74% a year on a compound basis. And these things can get very scary very quickly. And this is a football finance show. I know people that, joking aside about Michael Tate, I know people that have to borrow money from money lenders, and that's how they operate. And it's heartbreaking to hear some of the stories.
The interest rate, Kieran, it is confusing for some people. And when I say some people, I mean me, because I do try and take an interest in economic and financial affairs. It doesn't normally work, but I try. So, listening to the news last week about the Bank of England and the interest rate, so it then gets slightly confusing when you hear that there is an interest rate that's set, but banks are able to do whatever they want. They're not tied down to that. They can charge whatever rate of interest they want, which is where it gets a bit confusing for people like me.
Yeah, if we talk about the Bank of England's position, the Bank of England is known as the lender of last resort. As far as if you go back to 2008, remember when we had that car crash? The world economy genuinely was in danger of effectively going into administration, and the role of a central bank is, if Barclays have got a problem, if HSB have got a problem on a short-term basis, what they can do is that they can phone up the Bank of England, and the Bank of England will say, well, our base rate is 5.25%. So the Bank of England will lend to Barclays. But how is Barclays going to make money? Well, you make money as a bank by borrowing at 5.25 and lending yourself out at, say, 9. That's what you make on your own margins.
Right.
So that's why if we see the Bank of England's base rate going up, that has a ratchet effect, because the mortgage lenders say, well, look, we can't borrow from the Bank of England as cheaply as before, so therefore we've got to increase the rates that we charge to mortgage holders and so on.
Our next question, Kieran, comes from Luke Williamson. I like Luke Williamson. Kieran, to my knowledge, I've never met him. Luke, if we have met and had a conversation and I've forgotten about it, I apologise. But Luke strikes me as a lovely, warm, gentle, optimistic person, because he's asked a nice, warm, gentle, optimistic question, which is, I think I already know the answer to it, but it's a lovely question. And it's the sort of thing we've debated on a sort of meta level, if you like. But Luke says, now that Premier League clubs earn so much from broadcast deals, why do they continue to charge such high prices for season tickets when you take into account the negative press that expensive tickets create? And we discussed this just last week in the case of Fulham, did we not, Kieran? Would it not be ingenious, says Luke, in terms of positive PR, for the big clubs to make their season ticket prices far lower? It seems to me it wouldn't affect their total revenue that much. And we've spoken from the start, or you've tried to instruct me from the start, Kieran, about the ratio of match day income to broadcast income and so on. So it strikes me that Luke would have, they're going to sell out at Anfield anyway. Well, I suppose that's why they can charge what they want, because they're going to sell out at Anfield. I've answered my own question there, Kieran. Let's move on to question 3.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. There's an element of supply and demand. You and I are old enough to remember top flight football in the late 70s, and the grounds weren't full. And that's when I remember that it really kicked off when it went from £1 to £1.30 to watch Brighton at the Goldstone, because we'd just been promoted to the old First Division, the equivalent of the Premier League. So from the club's point of view, they are there to. It's not a case of maximising revenues. It's a case of trying to break even. 18 out of 20 clubs in the Premier League lost money in 2022 on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, they would argue, we need to recover that. If we take a look at the smaller clubs, the likes of Burnley and Bournemouth and Luton and so on, yes, they only get 3 to 4% of their total revenue coming from ticket sales. So do they have to increase prices? Probably not. But they would also argue, if we don't do that, then our losses go from, £8 million to £12 million. Who's going to fund that extra 4 or 5 million? If we take a look at the bigger clubs, we've got 3 clubs, Arsenal, Manchester United and Spurs, all generating more than £100 million a year from ticket sales, and they're selling out every single match. They would argue that actually they're selling tickets at too low a price. And for all of the stick which has been levelled at the Glazers, much of which is justified, Manchester United have frozen ticket prices for the main stands, I think for 10 years out of the last 11, something like that. Although I was contacted by somebody who's in a hospitality box at Manchester United to say that I think they had a 15% increase this season, and they've just had notice for next season, and it's going to go up another 20% because, again, Manchester United say we've got a long list of people. There's a waiting list for these, so why can't we charge you more? So clubs are going down that route, and also, the Glazers are sore because they've not had Super League and they've not had Project Big Picture, which would have improved their financial position. So now they're taking it out on the fans because it was, let's face it, it was the fans who brought down Super League.
And also, talking about, let's face it, Kieran, we know these are times of economic hardship for a lot of people, but there are still many, many people who can afford a box at Man United, no matter what it costs, and are only too happy to take the kudos that comes with that. Our third question, Kieran, comes from Andrew Floud. That's Floud. And the reason I know it's Floud is because Andrew says, I know Kevin had problems with my name previously, but it's Floud, pronounced Cloud with an F. So if I was more...
Clough, isn't it?
It's
Clough.
Clough, exactly. Kieran, I'm very proud. I feel the same way I did when Gary Lineker started writing his own puns. And I felt like a proud parent taking the stabilisers off a child's bike. You've been with me for long enough. You did my joke. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Sorry.
If only accountancy permeated from you to me in the same way comedy has permeated from me to you. But Andrew Floud has a question about La Liga, and he wants to know what happens when clubs go down there. Are there parachute payments in Spain like there are in the Premier League, says Andrew?
Yes, there are, Andrew. They were introduced by Tebas, I think it was about 2018-19. And I think, in my view, I've always sort of supported parachutes in terms of their formal aim, but I've also been critical of the level of parachutes. I think they're given for too long, and I think that they're too high. Spain, however, I think has got things slightly better. They're around about £12 million a year compared to, I think it works out as around about 43.5 million. The Premier League has just published its annual report, so I'll be reading that on the train heading up to Liverpool later today. If anybody sees an intense-looking man going, "Oh, parachute payments," that's probably me. And you only get them for 1 year in Spain, as opposed to 2 and 3 years, as far as the Premier League is concerned. And the other issue is that they are linked to the amount of time that you've spent in the Primera League, if you are relegated to the Segunda League. So therefore, if a club's been in the Premier League for 6 or 7 years, then you're going to get more money than a club's just gone straight up and come back down again. So I think Spain have got the optics better than we have here. I'm still broadly in favour of them as a concept, because I don't want to see any clubs going into administration. And the only way that clubs could cope if you abolish parachute payments is if they had wage clauses which would reduce wages by around about 80%. Upon relegation, and you're not going to get players to sign up to that. So then the clubs that get promoted, because they can't get the players to sign up to that, they automatically get relegated anyway.
See, I'm worried now that some of our less scrupulous listeners will book themselves a ticket on a train to Liverpool and stare intently at a spreadsheet on a laptop in the hope that they get mistaken for you. Guys, it's Kieran Maguire. There's a little snack pot there of alfalfa and quinoa. It must be him. So they can bask in the reflected glory of what it's like to be the country's leading football finance academic. This episode of The Price of Football is brought to you by NordVPN. If you use unsecure public Wi-Fi connections with your laptop or mobile device and worry about whether your data is safe, using NordVPN can protect you.
With NordVPN, your internet traffic is routed through a secure encrypted tunnel which protects your data and privacy. You can also have NordVPN on up to 6 devices. So that's your laptop, phone, smart TV, tablet, and even your router can all get the same level of protection. NordVPN is fast, easy to use, and you can connect with one click or even enable auto-connect for zero-click protection. I use it wherever I go.
Price of Football listeners can go to nordvpn.com/priceoffootball now to get an exclusive deal. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/priceoffootball. Be quick, because this offer is available for a limited time only. Oliver Bridge has a question, Kieran. We haven't had a one-club question for quite some time, but Oliver wants to know how his club, Colchester United, are doing financially under Chairman Robbie Cowling.
Yes, and of course we have Steve Lamack as our celebrity Colchester United fan.
We do.
And I've listened to the first episode of The Price of Music, and it was dead good as well. So if you finish with amortisation and us, move across to The Price of Music, our fellow podcast in the stable. Going back to Oliver's question, this is a classic example of you go, how much? Under Robbie Cowling, who operates a company called JobServe, Colchester United are losing £40,000 a week, £2 million a year. And you go, hold on, it's Colchester. They can't be signing that many players. And I've always had a soft spot for Colchester because one of the very first matches I went to was an FA Cup match against Leeds United, where I think it was Ray somebody scored a couple. Colchester beat the mighty Leeds United 3-2.
Ray Crawford.
Oh, Ray Crawford, that's right.
You were at that game?
I was at that game.
Wow.
Yeah. I was about 9 years old, and it was sort of, my parents said, just get out of the house, Kieran. Yeah,
wow.
That's how it was in those days,
Yeah.
Kevin. It was different times, wasn't it? And I was football mad.
Yeah, before we answer the rest of it, I mean, that's probably one of the most legendary games of football this country's ever seen. And the Colchester management got up to some really annoying tricks. And Don Revie was the master of dirty tricks. Because they put they put seats right on the touchline. They brought the narrowed the pit. That's you were that guy. I mean, what a terrible place to go and watch football. Lair Road used to be, but that's fantastic to say you were at that game. Anyway, the question, Kieran.
Yes. So the concern is, in total, Colchester United have lost £35 million. We're talking about a club which, how many people ever mention Colchester United? So Robbie Cowling is effectively treating it as a personal fiefdom. If the fans are frustrated without the money that's coming in, because all of that money has been provided to Colchester United in the form of interest-free loans, you would genuinely fear for the club's existence in the 92. So it's a classic, damned if you do and damned if you don't. The club doesn't get a lot of attention. Yes, the crowds are relatively static, but it's a very expensive hobby. Fortunately, his other business historically has generated enough profits to allow him to fund his football club, as is the case with many of the smaller clubs when you start to look into the intricacies and the details of the finances.
It's not that long ago, Kieran, probably only 10, 15 years, when people were talking about Colchester being able to establish themselves as a championship club. Is relatively, it's Norwich, Ipswich, Southend, I suppose, the closest clubs to them. So they should be getting decent crowds. So, as you say, it's taking that much money just for them to sort of tread water, essentially.
Yeah, and that just shows how expensive a business football is. Of the 92 clubs, more than 80 are losing money. In any other industry which has been in existence for more than a century, the businesses would have been closed down. And again, we're not going to labour a point about the music industry, but if you look at the number of music venues which are being closed down, clubs and theatres and so on, it's pretty horrendous. You take a look at the hospitality industry, restaurants and pubs are being closed down, and yet football manages to struggle on simply because the owners put on these blinkers and say, I'm not going to stop the club. And we are fortunate that there are enough owners who take that view, even though the much broader risks are very, very significant for what happens if the circumstances of that owner changes or they lose interest or whatever.
When we interviewed Steve Lamacq and Stuart Dredge as a sort of PR thing for the start of the Price of Music, it was both eye-opening and heartbreaking to hear Steve Lamacq say that he was introduced to two German tourists who said to him, can you recommend somewhere tonight in London that we can go and see some music, any music? And he went, no, because they've all gone. He said, whereas 5 years ago, I could have rattled off 15 places of various sizes where you could see music, and they just was. And he talked about a venue in Ipswich as well, a long-standing venue. Landlords put the rent up, that's it. You can't do it. So a place where the people of Ipswich and the talent of Ipswich, probably Ed Sheeran probably played there at some stage, that's gone. And it's, the way we talk about a football club going into administration or going bust for the lack of 30,000 quid, it's the same with these venues that people have loved all their life. Dan Greet has our next question, Kieran. I like the sound of Dan. I think Dan's a bit snarky, the same way I've been since about 10 to 5. Well, actually, no, since about 3:45 on Saturday. Dan Greet says, do we know, I don't know why I said it in a kind of semi-Mark Steele voice, do we know that would be like, do we know how much Deadpool and his mate, as Finley not a Mark Steele fan?
He's coming in.
He's coming in.
He's so impressed. He thought, who's that new bloke in the room?
Mark Steele's on the pod. Finley's great. He's waited for this moment as well. I'll just get some wonky chops and pull up a comfy beanbag. Listen to the rest of the pod, says Finley. Dan Greet says, do we know how much Deadpool and his mate have invested in Wrexham, and how much have they recouped via Disney Plus and increased sponsorship, etc.? It made me chuckle the way he just referred to him as Deadpool and his mate. But it's an interesting question, Kieran, because of course we've talked about this at some length, but I don't think we've ever actually gone into the detail of what they actually put into the club, the actual financial investment, and how much they might have recouped.
Yes, if we take a look at Wrexham's most recent accounts, and they go up to the 30th of June 2022, so the promotion season is probably going to cost them some more money. They lost £3 million in 21-22, and that's despite having the big sponsors. Their commercial income went through the roof because aviation, gin, and TikTok. They as opposed to, and this is no disrespect, to the local greengrocers or the local car mechanic company who are sponsoring the shirts and so on. So they had a lot more money coming in, but they were losing money. They spent £1.2 million on player on player signings, which is the record in the history of the National League. The two owners had put in between them £3.7 million in loans. So that was at June 2022. I suspect they put in significant amounts before that. And you were mentioning earlier about Bank of England base rates. Well, they have lent that money, and you think about Steve Parish at Palace. He's lent money to the club interest free. You're looking about Abramovich, Tony Bloom, all of these owners. They've lent money interest free. McElhenney and Reynolds are lending to Wrexham at the base rate plus 3%. So they are getting some of that money back. Now, in respect of how much are they recouping via Disney Plus, I think they are the executive producers of the show, so that's going to go into their private financial affairs back in the US. So we don't know how much the club has generated from these activities. And I think it's a shame that Wrexham used to be very transparent, they used to go beyond the call of duty in terms of what they would publish in the finances, and now they've taken we're only going to publish, effectively a bare minimum. We're not going to show the income statement. We're not showing the amount of money coming in, the wage bill, and so on. Perhaps they're a little bit sensitive about that. I don't know, but there have been some real positives. I mean, I was looking at the accounts, and on the back of the success of the show, again, this is 21-22, the number of people employed by Wrexham AFC went from 80 to 195 members of staff.
Oh,
That's more than an extra 100 jobs are being created on the back of these two guys. And I've said it on the show more than once. It's a great show. You don't have to be interested in football because it's about people. It's about the guy that runs the local pub. It's about the fans that have been going for 30 or 40 years. Yes, it involves a couple of the players. It involves my mate Sean Harvey, but I'd rather not talk about that. And so on. But they to date they've lost money, and people have said to me, surely if they sell the club, they'll recoup not just that money, the amount of money that they paid for the club, and a lot more. And if I was advising a buyer, I'd say be very, very careful. And this is not disrespectful to the football club or the fans, because I've been on a Fans United day at Wrexham and the fans are absolutely brilliant. The value in the Wrexham brand, to a certain extent, is coming from the owners. So if the owners go, if they get up to the Championship, and the owners then decide to cash out, doesn't mean you're going to get that same level of interest once McElhenney and Reynolds disappear.
It may come as no surprise, Kieran, to learn that I have been thinking about Steve Parish lately quite a lot. Is Steve Parish, oh boy, his ears will be burning, but clearly he can't read my mind because nothing's happened. Also, what is surprising though, Kieran, I think a lot of us, myself included, would have assumed that any money that McElhenney put into the club was either a gift or was interest free. So I'm quite intrigued to learn that it's 3.5% above base rate. So that's what
3%.
3%. So that's currently about 8.5%.
8.25, Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Richard D has a question, Kieran. I suspect it's probably made him slightly unpopular with the Baroness because it's a question that can only be answered by a spreadsheet, Kieran. It's a good one, though. Richard says, in light of the EFL and the Premier League becoming stricter with FFP breaches, with either penalty points or suspended penalty points, I started wondering what the league tables would look like if financial losses were subject to points deductions. For instance, for every £10 million a club loses in a given season, they get a point deducted for the following season. Appreciate this takes away performance on the pitch, but if it prevents the current arms race in overspending, then this would be a good thing, wouldn't it? I'd love to hear your take on this. I mean, it's a novel way of dealing with it. If everyone knows they're the rules, that if you're going to get a point deducted for every £10 million you lose, it would focus the minds of some club owners, wouldn't it?
It did, yes, because actually last night I was at, I'm not going to try to reopen. I went to the match yesterday, me, myself, Baroness, clearly in a good mood, and the Baroness said, I'm going to make one of your fantasies come true tonight. And I said, well, could you help me with this spreadsheet? I think it looks really exciting. And there was a look of great disappointment on her face. It has to be said. So I've put the numbers into a spreadsheet, and I've taken the losses from 21-22 and applied them to the 22-23 table. As far as the top of the Premier League was concerned, Manchester City would still be top, except I think they won by about 8 points. That lead would have actually been extended to 14 because Arsenal lost quite a lot of money in 22. As far as the top four are concerned, Liverpool would have made the final Champions League place, and Newcastle would have dropped to 6th. And Newcastle would have dropped to a Europa League place. If we take a look at the three clubs being relegated, again, that wouldn't have changed. So it would still have been Southampton, Leeds, and Leicester. But Chelsea would have dropped to 5th bottom in the Premier League. So they didn't have a good season, but they would have dropped to 16th. Newcastle would have dropped to 6 because they were in the first year of ownership of PIF, and therefore they incurred substantial losses. And you'll be delighted to know that Crystal Palace are still 12th. Whatever happens to Crystal Palace, we can always say still 12th. It's a bit like what the matches, the results at Selhurst is going to be 1-1 between us two.
Well, that's a bit at Selhurst, yeah, see, I see what you did there. Selhurst Park, it'd be 1-1. I was going to accuse you of slipping the stiletto in between the ribs there, Kieran, but you're quite. I would take. Oh God, my God! I yearn for 12th. I'd happily take 12th now. Steve Parish. I'm doing the full Muttley now, Kieran. Our penultimate question comes from Toby Anamashahan. Toby, I'm going to refer you back to Andrew Floud because if I've made a hash of pronouncing Anamashahan, then I apologise, but I could do with some notes here. Although it would be a fantastic score in Scrabble were you allowed to have surnames.
Yes.
Toby, it's an interesting question, Kieran, and we kind of talked about this issue with Pat Nevin just before Christmas, and it's also quite a sad question because it's very true. Toby says, my question is about the number of footballers who have gone bankrupt over the last few years. Can you give me some insight into how this happens and how players in the modern era can make decisions to avoid this in the future? And I know, I think in the past, the PFA have told us that it's as many as 30% of ex-players outside the Premier League have had serious financial issues or gone bankrupt following the end of their career.
That's right. And it's not just players who are in the lower leagues. So there's been Premier League players. I'm not going to mention names. I don't think that's appropriate. And also, for the sake of transparency, I work for the PFA. I do their finance courses for them. And I'm doing one at present. In respect of how it happens, is that if we take a look at our lifestyles, we get familiar with a certain level of expenditure in our life. And normally your income goes up throughout your career on an incremental basis, on a fairly sort of, can be very slow, but at least there's not going to be any shocks in terms of significant decreases. When it comes to being a professional footballer, you've gone from earning X per month. That can be a very large amount of money. And the reason why so many go bankrupt is that they get used to a lifestyle where they're spending 90, 95, 100% of that X, and then the taps get turned off very quickly. And yes, you've got the big house, and yes, you've earned, but you've still got a mortgage, you've still got a car, and the insurance for when you're a professional footballer, the insurance rates are very, very high, and the insurance rates for ex-professional footballers tend to be very high as well. So you might have some finance outstanding on the car. You've got the insurance costs. It could be that you have got kids who you put into school and you're paying for that. Your partner is used to a certain level of lifestyle as well, and all of that has to be reset upon retirement. And that's actually quite difficult because you've known some players, and I remember you telling me the tale about Neil Ruddock when he retired. He got a toothache. Was that the case? And he'd never had to go to an NHS. In fact, he didn't know what the process was because from the age of 8 or 9, whatever it was when you first come into the academy, the clubs look after the players. And this is from self-interest from the club's point of view. They don't want the players to think about anything else than football, anything else about remembering the drills, anything else about the next match, anything else about their responsibilities on the pitch. And they take that away from the players. And the critics will say, "Oh, the players lead a pampered life." No, this is actually coming very much from the clubs themselves. And you retire. All of a sudden, your agent, who's been responsible for your tax, has been responsible for paying some of your bills, has been responsible for your contracts and so on. They've disappeared because you're no longer of any benefit to them. You've no longer got the support from the club. And it is quite a cultural shock the PFA is trying to make sure that its members are getting that education and getting interested in personal finance. It's like many things in life. I know as a teacher, I'll do additional classes, before an exam, but I know that the people who most need to attend that additional class are the ones who are least likely to turn up. Well, it's the same, and this is not being critical of individual players or groups of players or trying to stereotype. It's not exciting. Nobody cares. If you're 22, 23, the thought of a pension, the thought of growing old, none of this is relevant to you. And it's still not relevant to us. And we're not as young as we used to be. We still think we're going to live forever. And trying to get the dull stuff across. Look, I know it doesn't affect you today, but in 10 years, 20 years time, you still want to be living in that house. You still want to be having a certain quality of lifestyle where you can go on a decent holiday or two a year and so on. It's very difficult getting it across, and you've got to plan for it. And there have been many successful. We know that some players have bought into huge numbers of properties, or have diversified, or have set up trusts and so on in advance. But some of them don't, and that's why we are seeing such a significant amount. And that goes hand in hand. Another big issue upon retirement is the high levels of divorce.
Yeah.
Because being in the environment of a dressing room 5 days a week, again, this is not being critical, it keeps you immature. Let's face it, we're in our 60s and we're immature, and we're fortunate we've both got partners who are very tolerant of our immaturity. But I think that dressing room mentality, and as somebody that played cricket for the same team for 30 years, the dressing room environment, just on one or two, just on a weekend, that was hilarious, brilliant, and so on. And the players miss that because they're used to that on a 5 or 6 day a week basis. They struggle, I think, from a mental point of view. And a lot of the time, they're a pain in the arse to live with as far as their partners are concerned, because now they're moping around the house, not knowing what to do with themselves. And things start to get fractious. That can lead to the breakdown of relationships. That can always be very, very expensive if there's a separation or divorce.
Another issue, Kieran, as well, which the PFA have told us about, is how many ex-players turn to gambling to try and replace the adrenaline of football, essentially. Because now, not only have they, and I've spoken to footballers, I've spoken to cricketers, very high profile Ashes winning cricketers who, basically the rest of their life is an attempt to recreate that dressing room environment, because there's never anything like it again. And as a comedian, I know what it's like to be in the dressing room full of comedians, and it's like, if you said to me that will never happen again, I'd be heartbroken. So I understand it, but so many footballers will turn to things like gambling, and because initially when they leave the game, they probably still have a fair bit of money in the pot, in the bank initially, then it's not an issue. But it only takes a year for that to disappear. But the age thing, I think, is the most important. It's like Pat Nevin said, it's not just football. If you say to a 21-year-old banker or a 21-year-old bricklayer, think about the future, of course they don't think about the future. They just know they're getting a bit of cash on the hip at the age of 21, and they're going to spend it. And because to them, 35, and that's the other problem when it comes to age, because most footballers leave the game at an age when other people in other jobs are getting just into the swing of things, and suddenly they're leaving at 35. They've got another 35 years, at least more, hopefully, ahead of them without the game they love. And there's only so many punditry jobs going out there, and Dion Dublin's got 2 of them, which seems unfair, doesn't it? Our last question, Kieran, comes from the only thing that could have made Wonka worse is if Dion Dublin turned up in a cameo role, being baffled by stairs in Willy Wonka's first tiny factory. How was that Oompa Loompa getting up to the second floor? Oh, stairs. I really am still in a bad mood after. So why is Roy Hodgson still in a job? Nah, man. Lovely man, child, lovely, smashing fella. Thomas Linsky has our last question. And this is an interesting question, Kieran. I didn't realise that this wasn't a done and dusted deal. But Thomas says, how much is still owed on the cost of building Wembley, and how much does hosting the semi-finals and finals of the FA Cup generate for Wembley? And is that enough?
Right. As far as the Football Association's real estate assets, its property at St George's Park and at Wembley itself is concerned, the total cost of those is around about £800 million. Now, the Football Association did borrow £175 million from the Bank of England as a COVID loan in 2020. That has now been repaid. It doesn't actually have any external debt. And part of the reason for that, and this is, I think, an emotive issue, is that the FA was given substantial grants by, I think, by the National Lottery Fund, or wherever it was, and I know that those grants are worth a couple of $100 million, or so. It was being funded through. When I do my Euro Millions on a Friday, I think it's going to a local hospice or a youth centre or something like that, and I go, Premier, so Football Association's new stadium seems to be. I'm not quite sure that's something I feel particularly comfortable with. But they don't actually have any outstanding loans because the COVID loan has been repaid, and fair play to them for that. They have received an awful lot of money, £125 million has been received in advance from broadcasters and sponsors before the Premier League before the Football Association have delivered in terms of England matches and the FA Cup and so on. So that's the first question in respect of Thomas. How much does hosting the semi-finals and the final of the FA Cup generate for Wembley? They don't break down the individual matches. What they do is they put a collective for England matches and other. There has been, I think, a debate, especially amongst football fans, in relation to, is Wembley the appropriate place for semi-finals of an FA Cup? I'm old school. I quite like the idea. I went to Highbury in 1983, and that seemed, because Wembley was sacrosanct.
Yeah,
it was kept. But the introduction of semi-finals at Wembley was partly done because it's got greater capacity, but partly due to the fact that it did provide additional finance to the Football Association when the spending on Wembley was high. Now, some people say, well, it didn't go that far over budget, but the reason for that is because the budget was ridiculously high to begin with, and I don't think that the National Stadium should be based in London, because there's too much London-centric viewpoint of the country. From a geographical point of view, you've got those clubs in the Midlands, in the Northwest and the Northeast who are entitled to a shorter journey, just as fans from London clubs.
Yeah, well, you know my views on that, Kieran. I don't think this country is London-centric enough, as far as I'm concerned. But even I think the National Stadium, and of course there's historical reasons why it ended up at Wembley, but it should be in the Midlands. It should be in the West Midlands. It should, around the NEC or where Birmingham International Airport. That's where the National Stadium should be, somewhere with really, really good transport links that, as you say, everybody can get to in an easier way. I meant to ask you this the other day, Kieran, because we discussed the notion that the semi-finals of the Carabao Cup were going to stay two-legged for at least for the next 2 or 3 seasons. But I meant to ask you, when they inevitably do become one-match affairs, if the Carabao Cup survives, that is, do you think the Football League would then be looking to hire Wembley to host those? That
will be one option. It would certainly sell out Wembley. You'd easily get 80,000. And that would the clubs object, because clearly the Football Association would take a slice, or would they say, well, if it is Middlesbrough, as we've seen, then actually we'll probably make more money because we're getting to play in front of an 80,000 capacity. So I think it is one option. Another option is that you do something similar to what we're seeing in the Italian Super Cup, and it gets played overseas. Everything and anything is up for grabs these days. Having two semi-finals and a final of a competition spread over a week in New York, in Mumbai, in Beijing, in Riyadh could be very, very lucrative for the EFL. Now, I'm not saying as a fan I'd want it, but things aren't necessarily. So money talks. We've always said.
I think it's a measure of how much the game has changed, Kieran. I noticed on Sky a few days ago, the result of an Italian Cup game that had been played in Saudi Arabia, and it took about 10 minutes for it to sink in and just go, well, Saudi Arabia? And you go, well, fair enough. That's the world we live in. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution to the pod as well, that would be very kind of you. And it will get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. I should point out, Kieran, before we get angry emails from some of our listeners in that part of the world, I'm not questioning the fact the game was played in Saudi Arabia. I'm questioning the fact it wasn't played in Italy. It doesn't matter where outside Italy it should have been played, but it should have been played in Italy. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, on our next, well, it won't be our next questions pod, Kieran. It'll be, if you're lucky, it'll be this year, but it certainly won't be our next one. But you can email us your questions at questions@priceoffootball.com. We'll be back on Thursday with our normal news pod. Until then, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary cheerful farewell.
Well, thank you, everybody who's been in contact, who's giving us stories. We do have a series of snouts these days that would make Grouty from Porridge absolutely delighted. If you want to use Patreon, that way you can get an ad-free version of the show and the quizzes and so on. That would be grand. But equally, if you just want to support us the show in any other way, why not just give us a review? It helps us with the charts, helps us with algorithms. Doesn't matter what you say. So you could even say, and I suspect this could be quite a feisty conversation. You could even say you'd have it hosted by Mark Steele and Roy Hodgson, and I think we would have a very intrigued listenership.
There'd only be one winner.
Yes.
Oh, actually, no, I don't know. Having interviewed, actually, I'm thinking about that. Would be a feisty matchup. That's boxing versus MMA. That is. Well, yeah, we could make that one happen, Kieran, as well.
Oh.
Most of them we can't do. We could put feelers out to see if that one could happen. Let's face it. Hopefully, one of them's going to be more available in the next couple of days than he has been in the past few days. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.